I'm going to be showing you how to do the continuous bound placket. I am doing it on the same piece that I'm doing the tailored placket. So you'll notice that this is midway done, and that's partially just because I'm doing them simultaneously, so I don't have to change my lighting setup. So ignore this. We're paying attention to the continuous bound placket, which is the one on the right. Notice this is the wrong side of my fabric. I have the wrong side of this long strip here, which the pattern piece looks like this. It's available on the same page that you got this one. And what we're going to do is, before I start using this piece of fabric, I am going to do a preliminary stitch. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to stitch all the way from the bottom of one. I'm not paying attention to that center line, but from the bottom of one, I'm going all the way up to the top, following that line pretty precisely. Once you get about an inch away from the top, switch your stitch length down to like an inch, not an inch, down to a 1 or a 1.5. And notice I am getting really, really close to that point. Make sure you don't accidentally cross that center line. Once I get to the top, I like to swivel the fabric and take a single stitch at the top going this direction. So I made that single stitch, and now I'm going to pivot it again and come down the other side. And about an inch away from that point, I'm going to change my stitch length back to a 2.5. And this is where it gets nerve-wracking for people. What we're going to do now is we're going to take our snippers or scissors or whatever, something very sharp, and we're going to cut down the center of that line all the way up to the point. And we're not going to snip through the point. We're going to make sure that we go right to that line of stitching so that we can open this entire thing up. Then what we're going to do, we're still working with the wrong side of the fabric, but we're going to take the right side of this fabric and place it down. And we're going to take that whole unit and flip it over to the right side. So I'm looking at this now, and here is my strip of fabric. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up at a 1/4 inch. Well, I'm just going to line them up perfectly down here at the bottom. But I'm going to be sewing at a 1/4 inch along this long piece. This needs to remain at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this entire long strip. However, notice that I have this line of stitching here that gets closer and closer and closer to the edge. That line of stitching needs to remain a 1/4 inch away from this long straight edge. So what it's gonna do is the edges of the fabric will not stay perfectly lined up. What's going to stay lined up is this seam line is going to stay exactly a 1/4 inch away from the cut line over here. So I'm going to pin that, and I'm going to sew right on top of that seam line all the way up to the point. Make sure you backstitch. Once I get to the point, I'm going to take all of this fabric that's hanging out here. Let me see if I can bring that up and zoom in a little bit. Whoop. I'm going to take all this extra fabric here, I'm going to pivot it around out of the way towards the back so that I can still see this long strip of fabric coming out here. And then I'm going to line up this bottom part at the end, down here. This will perfectly line up. And then this line of stitching should, if it's all nice and tight and I sewed the first part, this line of stitching should be 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And I'm just going to continue stitching. Notice that at the point I had my needle down. I put my needle down and then lifted the foot so that I could reorganize everything. So anytime you're going to lift the foot to reorganize, make sure that your needle and your machine is down. And I'm going to just keep on stitching right around that point and down the other side. Notice I'm using the zipper foot. You don't have to use the zipper foot on this. It doesn't even necessarily make it easier, other than maybe you can see a little bit more what you're doing. Once that is all done, it should look like this on one side. I'm going to back that up now. It should look like this on one side and like this on the other side. And what I can do now is I can go and press all of the seam allowance towards my long strip of fabric. And that's what I'm going to do next, is I'm going to go do a whole bunch of pressing on here. To press the continuous bound placket, we're going to be looking at the side that we have all of our stitching on. And I am going to simply fold down my edge, the 1/4 inch seam allowance that it has. And I'm going to press that all the way along. Sorry, my phone just went off. Pressing all the way along. Once I've pressed all the way along, I'm going to fold it over again to completely cover everything, all of those construction details up. And make sure you fully cover up that stitch line. Just barely. We don't have enough fabric to go crazy on it, but we have enough to just cover everything up nicely. Once we've pressed it like that, we can go back to sewing it and finish it up. To finish the continuous bound placket, we just got done pressing along here, and we came back and we pinned everything so that it's covering up that line of stitching and everything. Now what we're going to do is at 1/16 of an inch from this section that's barely covering up the stitch line, at 1/16 of an inch, I'm going to sew it down. Since this is the right side of the fabric, the garment, make sure that you cover up that line of stitching. Make sure all of this excess fabric stays out of the way as you sew through that point. Once that's sewn, it's basically done. Just one more tiny step. This is all folded. All of this excess stuff can fold to the outside of the fabric. So you can see it standing up on the outside like that. but mostly we can make it so that it's practically invisible. So we're going to slide it all to the inside. And once it's slid to the inside, I can line this bottom up down here. I'm just folding it. And I have this little corner sticking out like that. And I am going to sew a diagonal line from here up to the point. Just from there to there at a diagonal line. And what that's going to do is it's going to force the stitching, all of the, it's forcing the bound placket to stay on the inside of the garment. This kind of placket shows up in women's wear. It also shows up in children's wear. It does not show up in men's wear. At least I've never really seen it. I can think of a couple times where we might want to use it, but for the most part, you just see it in women's and children's wear. This side will always stay sticking out, and this side will always stay folded back. And it should be almost invisible. You should just see a little line that you can stick your finger in. You can use this for like the back neckline, for getting in like a shirt that has a tight neckline. You could see one of these on the back of the neck as well. And that is how you sew a continuous bound placket.